So welcome everyone. My name is Viv Lee, she, her, for the Ontario Digital Literacy and Access Network, which is in soon to be the Open Digital Literacy and Access Network. We are a nonprofit organization that works to remove digital literacy and access barriers to us LGBTQI plus people and communities face on the internet with a Canadian-centric focus. ODLAN creates resources, hosts training sessions, and conducts research to work towards a more equitable online experience for 2S LGBTQI plus people. I very quickly want to do a land acknowledgement. I am personally in the colonial area of Toronto. ODLAN staff, board members, and volunteers are located throughout the colonial state of Canada. The area where we primarily work, known as Toronto, has been cared for by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. And I have the absolute pleasure of introducing Dr. Patrick Keilty today. So Patrick, thank you for joining us. Patrick is an associate professor in the Faculty of Information and Cinema Studies Institute at the University of Toronto. Professor Keilty's research interests focus on the politics of digital infrastructures in the sex industries, adult film, and materiality of sexual media. So welcome. Thank you very much, Patrick, for joining us today.
It's my pleasure, Viv. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me. I'm really thrilled to be here and to be able to talk about queer data studies. So you probably read the blurb for the book, and I'll just talk maybe a little bit, Viv. Should I start with like how I came to this book, to edit this book? So several years ago, and I hate to bring this up right out of the gate, but when Donald Trump was first elected, I worked with the Technoscience Research Unit and particularly a scholar, Murphy, named Michelle Murphy at the University of Toronto, to organize an event called Guerrilla Archiving. And it was an event to save environmental data that would have been lost during a presidential transition. The then incoming administration made it clear that they wanted to get rid of this data. And that event ended up being very meaningful and a lot of work. And at the end of it, it kind of left me wondering more about data politics. And although I had some forays into data politics, it occurred to me that nobody had really written a whole book on or edited a book on queer data politics, but there was an emerging scene of people who were publishing in that area. And so when a chance came along to edit a book, I chose this theme and was very lucky to receive lots of excellent submissions. And I was lucky to have found a really good home for it, which was the University of Washington's Feminist Technoscience series. And yeah, it ended up being a really great quality collection. Two of the chapters won Best Paper of the Year award in their fields, one for the American Historical Association, the sort of LGBT Best Paper of the Year, and then the other for Best Graduate Student Paper of the Year from the Society for the Social Studies of Science. And so I was really lucky to have such an excellent group of scholars. And I think one of the major, I went into the book thinking that there would be a clear sort of takeaway after having read what some really brilliant people think about queer data. I thought we're going to be able to articulate a clear sort of data ethics or politics out of the readings. But what I realized after receiving so many great articles is that there's not actually a very clear answer about what queer data studies or what queer data politics might look like, other than, there are times when you want to be counted and there are times that you don't want to be counted. And there are ways in which queer people engage with sort of evidentiary practices that can't be reduced to numbers alone. So instead of having something very clear and concrete to as a takeaway, I think the book ends up becoming about a kind of ambivalence about data, and it's about the times when you want to be counted and not. It's about what forms of evidence or not that are taken up, and the kinds of evidence that are meant for particular communities and can disappear without a trace when it's not for those communities as a form of queer survival. And so the book is really about these kinds of more either ambivalent politics or more contextual and situated, or even sort of, I guess, nebulous approaches to data. And so it becomes about, I think, what an even more sophisticated understanding of data than what I had gone in with. Um, yeah.
Thank you very much. That's a wonderful place to get started from. So for those of the community here who are not familiar with the book, we'd love to get sort of a layperson or non-academic overview. As we like to say, explain it to me like I'm five. I just want to make an operational note for folks. Please add questions in the chat. I'd be happy to ask them on your behalf as they come up. We recognize questions are often context specific, so we don't want to force you to wait till the very end. So please add them to the chat if you like, and I'd be happy to support you with asking those to Patrick directly. But Patrick, tell us about this book from the layperson or non-academics perspective.
Oh, gosh, I thought I thought I had done it as simply as I could. But yeah, I mean, the really quick take, which you can see in the blurb, is that data has the power to be both perilous and powerful. It can be summoned to produce certain kinds of evidence. It can be summoned to make certain kinds of arguments, but it can also be summoned against certain kinds of arguments, or it can be summoned to sort of despoil queer lives as well. And so it has this sort of both powerful and dismantling force. And in the book, we cover a range data in a range of contexts, everything from evading police and not being surveilled by law enforcement to the failure of data to scale in community-based ride-sharing apps, to the problems of the scale of data in global health development policies, to the politics and policies of major tech companies. So there's just a really rich range of approaches to data. We've got data in artistic contexts, data in sort of sociological or development contexts, data in sort of tech, sort of Silicon Valley tech company contexts, and then data in historical contexts in terms of like, surveillance in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And so there's, one of the things we didn't want to do is have this sort of singular approach to data. We wanted to conceive of it broadly. And we wanted to see what we could learn from different approaches and different disciplinary approaches and different geographic locations. There's articles in here that focus on China, Lebanon, Eastern Europe, as well as Canada and the United States. And so we're sort of interested in not just having a single approach or a single temporal period or a single geographic region. But, of course, the book is not comprehensive. It couldn't possibly cover everything. It's really just a kind of starting point and an invitation for more research in this area. So it really serves as a baseline and certainly not the end of a conversation.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. Yes, there's a large tapestry of perspective in the book. And you've got 10 separate chapters with 10 separate authors' perspectives, as you mentioned, from all walks of life internationally. So I can appreciate the difficulty of putting that together. So can you tell us a little bit about the process of selecting and curating this list of material?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So The book started right before lockdown during the pandemic. So I'd put out the call for papers, and then, like, maybe a month later, um, we had all been in lockdown. And I remember thinking, gosh, is anything going to happen with this book? Because everybody is probably scrambling to take care of friends and loved ones, and it's not clear that they're going to have capacity to write something. So we were very flexible with time and generous with time. And in the end, I was really, like I said, really grateful for the quality of articles I received. I initially did my own sort of double-blind peer review process, and sent chapters out to people I knew that were sort of in the general area that the chapter was written. And then after I had selected what I thought was a good number of quality chapters, they then went to the press, and the press also sent them out for peer review. And there was some more cutting at that point. So there was a real, there was two double-blind peer review processes to get it to the point where we had the 10 chapters that ended up being published. And, cutting is never easy. It's a really painful process. There are things that I wish were in here, but that for different reasons couldn't be, either fit or changes that needed to be made in a particular timeline. And so, these books are never sort of what you thought they were going to be going into the process. It's always an iterative process. And you hope that you have enough stuff by the end of it to have a quality book. And I was, like I said, just really glad that we had so many people interested in publishing in it.
Thank you. Yeah, and I can only imagine what is left on the cutting room floor. I'm sure you have
Um,
plenty to do a second edition.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, well, what I try to do when something like that happens is not to just leave it on the cutting room floor, but to contact, if especially if it's a pre-tenure or emerging scholar, I try to contact an journal that I think it'll be good for, and say, look, this was submitted to a book I'm editing. For whatever reason, it's not able to fit in the book, but I think it would be a great addition to your journal. And when you contact the editors like that, they might take, especially if you let them know it's an emerging scholar, they'll take special care when putting it through the peer review process. And so my hope is that the things that fell on the cutting room floor ended up getting published and having a life and are out there in the world, that they didn't just stay on the cutting room floor. So.
that's great. Thank you very much. Apologies, there's a recording in the background. I'm sorry for the background noise. With regards to the chapters themselves, I know you spent a lot of time reviewing them and considering the work. What were the crown jewels of this book? Can you tell us a
Oh,
bit more about the content you've selected?
well, they're all great. I mean, I don't want to, there are a few that I really loved because I thought they were so unexpected. The two that won awards were the very first chapter or second chapter, I think, by Nikita Shepard, which is about the sort of pre-Stonewall surveillance, like the avoidance of surveillance by law enforcement in New York of gay and lesbian communities. And then Shui Shui Wang's chapter at the end of the book was the one that's about, it was about sort of tracking LGBT health in China as part of a development cause. And the argument Shui Shui makes is that it's a form of sort of there's certain elements of neocolonialism that are part of that process. And then I also really loved Harris Kornstein's article about Homobiles, which is the community-based ride-sharing app. And Harris writes about the failure to scale and the way this app was designed to not collect data or to have minimal amounts of data as a kind of ethical approach to data. Um, and and yeah, I mean, I think when we talked earlier, Viv, you really loved the chapter called what was it called again? Now it's been a while since I even
Objectionable nipples.
objectionable nipples, which was about, yeah, Facebook's content management politics and the way that they basically have harmed queer people in particular, but really a range of people have been harmed by some of those politics. So yeah,
Yeah, the evolution of Meta's Puritan
yeah,
policies around um, discriminatory practices of censorship and
yeah,
what they deem to be acceptable versus not acceptable, and the excruciating detail that they go into about what is deemed appropriate for our
yeah,
collective society.
yeah.
Um, the notes from that author about them creating the standard based off of Victoria's Secret models I thought was
Uh-huh.
particularly
Yeah.
interesting. And
Mhm.
their other note about the collection of nudes that they did in 2017. There's a whole collection of terrifying facts about the history of Facebook and Meta
Yeah.
that's
As if the his
presented.
Yeah, as if the history of Facebook wasn't terrifying enough, we needed.
Absolutely. But it's almost like an overwhelming amount of data that we're presented with, right? So we get
Yeah.
this saturation
Mm,
of knowledge and we don't retain it. But
mm.
the reality that Facebook was actively asking people to send them their nudes
Yeah.
as a way to prevent future revenge porn options
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
where
Yeah.
and so they had hundreds of thousands of
Yeah.
data points that they were using. This is wild
Yeah.
information.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it is wild. Yeah. Yeah. And that trains systems that are then used, right, to sell data points that are often sold to third parties. I mean, you don't necessarily always have control over where that data goes. So
Oh,
yeah.
we never do. We
Yeah.
have to operate from a place of assuming we have no control.
Mhm. Mhm.
Especially given the recent changes, and I'd love to dig into that later. But um,
Sure.
can you tell us? There was a couple articles or chapters, I suppose, in there around uh, gay hookup sites and the international use of platforms like Grindr and how queer men especially really enjoy sharing information and the use of those platforms to share information in international, not necessarily
Mm.
culturally safe spaces. Can you tell us a bit about that?
So yeah, I think you're referring to there's one article about by Matthew Gagne that's about hookup culture in Lebanon and the use of predominantly gay men's apps to find sexual hookups. And part of the point of that article was and it's another one of those articles that's just clever and not a dogmatic, sort of surprising understanding of how data might work in a different context. So much of that article is about how there's a kind of as just part of hookup culture, there's a sort of exchange of data that is part of a sort of consent-based practice. Who's going to play what role, what to expect when you get to the person's apartment. And what was also interesting about that article was that it was within the context of doing an ethnographic study. And part of the case that the author makes is to call attention to the way ethnographers have no sort of ethical problems with certain kinds of relations between friends, but do have problems between the ethical relations between one night stands, even though the context of those relationships, that it's for a study, that it's only going to last an evening, is really made clear up front just as part of the process of a sort of hookup culture that's not always there in other ethnographic contexts. And so it sort of flips the hat on what constitutes an ethical ethnographic relationship. I think it's probably one of the more spicy takes within the book, but I thought it was a really well-argued piece that causes, I think, ethnographers to rethink the ethics of their own field and what constitutes an ethical relation that is that if it is about data extraction, right, then what are the contexts in which this can be made more ethical or less ethical? And it's not always the most obvious relations. But you might also be thinking about, I mean, there's another article that's about male sex workers and yeah, and the leakiness, I guess, of data in on some of the sex work sites. And yeah, I mean, at the end of that article, the author Ryan Conrad basically calls for the need for more community-based approaches to like sex work platforms, more community-based approaches to data management within the community, which, you know, one of the, I mean, there's what's sort of convenient is there's another article, the one about ride sharing apps, that's a community-based app that you think might be an answer to that call. But Homobiles doesn't exist anymore. And some of the histories of these attempts to get community-based platforms is that they don't always scale, as Homobiles shows. And so they don't always fit within particular kind of economic models which is necessary for them to thrive. So we also see in the book the limits of what's possible in terms of a data politics. And you know, even though we're being asked to think creatively about these limits, there are certain kinds of like economic realities that we come up against that we haven't thought through entirely. So
Yeah, and I want to pull back to I think it's the second chapter where they discuss sort of the historical context of more analog data collection. Sort of,
yeah,
I appreciate that there is a throwback to the pre-internet days of
yeah, oh
how
yeah,
data used to be collected about, especially queer men, and under the lavender scare and the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Can you tell
yeah.
us a little bit about that chapter? Because I think that's a really wonderful, for those of us who live in the internet era, it's great to talk a little bit about our history there.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a number of attempts described in the book, not just in that one, but in Gary Kafer's article as well, and in my introduction about queer people's practices to sort of be undetected by law enforcement. The introduction actually starts with a quote by Jose Munoz, an article he wrote for the journal Women in Performance called I think it's on like on the ephemera as evidence, I think is the name of the article. And in it, he talks about the way there's certain kinds of queer gestural forms that disappear at the touch of anyone who would despoil queer lives. So it was, these are things like whether it's slang or whether it's cruising culture, where it's intended just to be picked up on by people within its epistemological sphere. So people who would recognize it for what it is, but it's not easy to recognize for law enforcement. And so law enforcement find it hard to summon, glancing as evidence for something. And so there are ways in which queer people have developed sort of cultural practices, performance practices, gestural practices that are meant to evade detection by people who would despoil queer lives. And so that's in part the chapter is about the attempts, the sort of, yeah, analog attempts by queer people not to be detected, not to be counted. And certainly the lavender scare would be a good example of that. And certainly even in the sort of early days of sort of a kind of gay liberation moment. Um, yeah,
Sorry, my educator brain just went off and I realized we're
yeah,
talking about a term that we have not explained.
okay.
For those of us who are not well read on the topic, can you quickly explain what the lavender scare was?
So yeah, I think there's also a Canadian equivalent, but I'll start with the lavender scare, which is it was a period during the 1950s in the United States in the Cold War when it was thought that homosexuals, because they were living often this sort of double life or secret life, necessarily because there was such stigma around around being gay or queer or having a sort of non-normative sexual orientation, that they were more susceptible to blackmail. And so the government didn't want you working for the US government in particular roles, but really they kind of tried to drive gay people out of government jobs. In general, this is kind of a sad thing to bring up now as the US is cutting so many thousands upon thousands of civil servants from from the federal workforce. Yeah, it was this sort of highly political attempt to get non-normative people out of the government because they were seen as a threat to national security because their lifestyle could be easily used for blackmail, or at least this was the logic at the time. And I will look up, I am embarrassed to say, um, the Canadian one is called, they have it's, well, on Wikipedia, they just call it the anti-gay purges in Canada. But
Yeah.
it has a name, and I'm like totally blanking on it right now.
No, you're right. It is the purge.
Oh, the Purge. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
right.
there
Yeah,
is
because
a
there's something in, I think the federal government had even set up something called the Purge Fund at one point in
it's
Canada.
still going.
It's still going, yeah, where you can apply to the government to memorialize some aspect of the purge, or I think there's different things you can use the purge fund for, but I know that's one of them.
Absolutely. It's actually out right now.
Okay,
Well
yeah,
timed.
nice.
Yeah, our we work with a lot of community outreach organizations, and they are doing active practice of archiving stories and elders and making sure that um, our data is kept. And
Yeah,
that's exactly what that fund is for. So I'm
yeah, that's right.
grateful that we have it available to our
Yeah,
communities.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so there's a real, I think, history and for responding to these sort of surveillance. I mean, the government did deploy certain kinds of surveillance tactics to get rid of LGBT people from the federal workforce. And just like they're doing now, they've asked people to snitch on their coworkers who they suspected of not aligning with the administration's ideology. So
Yeah. We keep jumping timelines a bit. So I think I want to
yeah.
ask this question next. So it's been 18 months, about 19 months since this book has been published.
The book came out in I think it was technically released right at the end of 2023 in December 2023. So it's been
Goodness.
out for maybe a year and a month, I would say. Yeah.
Okay. So it has not been that long.
Yeah, yeah.
Since the year and a month that it's been published, then what pieces should be updated or would you update based off of the year we've had?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the one about male sex workers should probably be updated because there's been a string of laws now trying to shut down. I mean, the shutting down of sex worker platforms goes back to the Obama administration. So that in and of itself is not new, but there are new techniques and strategies for trying to make make these legal, or to expand the ways in which people's access to certain sites is denied, and that includes age verification laws, where you might have to turn over government identification, driver's licenses, sometimes in certain states in the United States, birth certificates, over to a third party who verifies your age. And some people will argue, oh, well, how is this different from a brick and mortar institution where you had to show ID? And the difference, of course, is that the data is not kept, and that the proprietors of the brick and mortar shops were also subject to social opprobrium, and so had a real incentive to treat their customers with the utmost discretion, because they had a kind of shared vulnerability that these third party tech platforms don't always have. In some cases, like in the UK, they even are trying to play with facial recognition technology to estimate your age, which is scary and obviously not technologically feasible. And of course, these laws don't account for the fact that people can have IP addresses or sorry, can have VPNs that change your IP address, or they don't account for the fact that a lot of websites aren't in the jurisdiction where the law was passed, and so they can bypass those laws. So they just are really silly laws, but that's one that might need to be updated. I would want to know more about other sort of community-based platforms that are out there that people have tried to build. I know with sex workers, it's interesting. Ryan's call at the end of that article has actually not his specific article, but there's been a general call for more community-based platforms, and there are people who've answered that call. And I want to know how those are going, and maybe put Ryan in touch with them to see what he thinks of their platforms. Um, yeah, I think this obviously Meta has gone in crazy directions since this book was published, and so maybe we would want to also update that chapter, the objectionable nipples one. So yeah, I think there's a lot that could be updated.
I agree. We're all sort of experiencing whiplash from the terms of service two-step, as I like to call it,
Yeah.
where organized companies, large-scale companies, will present you with the software product with a certain standard that you consent
Yeah.
to as part of that agreement, right? I am
Yeah.
checking yes on the terms and conditions of this product, and then they bait and switch you with an adjustment or change. This is
Yeah.
also seen with OpenAI,
Yeah.
who
Yeah.
originally started as a people first, environmentally focused
Environmental.
nonprofit concept and has rapidly evolved or
Yeah.
devolved, I should say,
Yeah.
into a capitalist
And
alternative.
environmentally destructive. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, almost the exact antithesis of its
Yeah.
original concept.
Yeah.
Um, and the same can be said for the recent shift in that's an understatement in Meta's uh, consent laws and
Yeah.
terms of service. Um, and to your point about sex workers organizing, there is a chapter in the book that I really appreciate around the development of the Ottawa Independent
Mm.
Companion
Yeah.
Collective, or what was it called again?
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, that's in the chapter I mentioned from Ryan Conrad about the leaky data of sex work. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, and I think that is a brilliant concept.
Mm.
It's a very sort of user-centered,
Yeah.
completely data sovereign design where we have pure ownership of our actions and profits and collective organizing
Yeah.
around safety and sex work. They've even built in
Mm.
a resilience fund so that folks, when they need to
Yeah.
take time off from their work, they have something to fall back on. It
Yeah.
is a really a union style
Yeah. Yeah.
organizing.
And yeah, there are sort of union style forms of organizing for sex work here and there throughout the world. I mean, of course, New Zealand has union style organizing. In the United States, parts of California and Vegas have union style organizing for sex work. Even for you to be able to organize in that way, the laws have to be a certain way. But they're not always that way in Canada, actually. In Canada, they while they don't criminalize the sex worker, they criminalize the John, which is the Nordic model. And that's probably one of the most harmful approaches to sex work regulation that you can have in a country. It's ostensibly progressive, but in reality, it forces the work to be even more underground than if both sides were criminalized, and it means that the Johns, in order to protect themselves, ask sex workers to put themselves at greater risk in order to do their work. So.
Yeah. What is your perspective on these third party applications that host sex workers and their Johns to allow them to meet and the use of that data? That's talked about quite a bit too.
So yeah, I mean, I was on um, Rent Boy and Craigslist back in the day. This is pre-smartphone. And it was critical. I mean, I'm not sure it just it made doing that work a lot safer. Those, especially Rent Boy, would verify the identification of the John before you met with them. And, so that there was this requirement of vulnerability on the part of the John before you met up with them, and you could make sure they were who they were. You could see the ID for yourself. Obviously, Craigslist didn't do that. Yeah, Rentboy made, I think, doing sex work safer in a way that, say, Craigslist maybe didn't. But nevertheless, with Craigslist, even with Craigslist, you could interact with somebody and get, exchange email addresses and things like that before meeting up with them. And so it's really, I think, critical to have these kinds of conversations before meeting up with people. That's very different from sex work where you don't have that opportunity. And I think when the Obama administration really struck down things like Backpage and forced OnlyFans to take its personal ads offline and went after Rent Boy and accused them of pimping because they did charge a fee for you to use their site, right? Um, and so it was that charge that the Obama administration accused Rent Boy of pimping people, which is really not, I mean, really a false equivalency. It's pretty outrageous that argument flew in court. But also, paying for sex was illegal in parts of the United States still, sadly. And so that made, I mean, technically that's what the Obama administration went after them on and then claimed that it was this, sort of large, yeah, pimping operation, which is outrageous. But yeah, in taking those platforms down, they actually took away a safety mechanism for sex workers and cost a lot of people money and cost them their livelihoods. So,
Thank you. We talked a lot about North America. Is there a nation with federal policy where sex work and queer data is prioritized, or is there a use case
oh,
that we can turn to?
I don't know. I mean, the gold standard, legal scholars say the gold standard for sex work laws is New Zealand. I don't know about New Zealand's data privacy or data politics. I know some people point to Europe for some of that, although some of that. Oh, sorry, Sydney.
Mm,
Oh,
Sorry, I think Sydney's. We need to be careful
okay.
there. Sorry, you were saying?
That's okay. So yeah, I think I mean that's my understanding is that New Zealand's the gold standard legally. And as far as data, the sort of data I guess, policies. A lot of people point to Europe. My understanding is that that has had sort of mixed effects, and some of it is pretty shallow and doesn't do what it's supposed to do. So I can't answer the second part of the question. But yeah, I mean, for sex work stuff, the idea is to decriminalize both the John and the sex worker so that neither of them face an uneven risk. So.
So the gold standard would be to decriminalize everything.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
There
a
are
simple
some,
answer. Isn't that
yeah,
lovely?
it is a simple answer. Yeah, if you go to decriminalizing sex work, let me make sure I've got the website correct. Um, if you go to decriminalizing, where is it? Where is it? Oh, um,
Is there an argument to be made for local policy instead of federal or provincial policy? Like, should this be a local issue?
well, attorneys general can choose not to enforce, a sex work law if they think that it is actually doing harm to the community and or the law is unethical. And I'm not sure in Ontario what the attorney general does, but I can assume, since it's the Ford government, that that it's probably still prosecuting these laws. But there was a time, I know when Kathleen Wynne's government was in power, the attorneys general chose not to pursue anti-sex worker enforcement. So I think there's a couple questions in the chat.
Yes, I think one of my we have a chat, decriminalizesex.work
Oh
as
yeah, that's
the
it.
link
I
that
think
you're
that's the
looking
one.
for. Somebody's already on it.
Yes, that's totally the one.
I
Thanks.
think
Yeah,
you're among
that's
friends here.
oh,
Um,
okay. Yeah, they
Great.
are great. I go to the industry expos all the time in Vegas and LA, and they're often at the one in Vegas. So yeah.
Okay. Well, with all of this content swirling around in your brain, what's next for you? What do you want to do next?
Well, I have a lot on my plate. But yeah, I mean, I've got a couple of articles I'm trying to write now. One is actually about film archives for a special issue of a journal called Archivaria. And then the next article is about AI porn. And
Can you
sort
tell
of
us a little bit about that?
some of the arguments haven't been written, but I know some of it is about undoing assumptions about how AI works and the fact that like it really is based on the hegemony of visual images that came before. So it's not, I mean, there are people who have really said some things about how AI is revolutionizing porn. And I want to just make sure folks know that it's actually based on an approximation of what already exists. So it's not really producing a new aesthetic. It's producing an approximation of an aesthetic we're already familiar with. And we'll also have, because I'm co-authoring it with an undergrad of mine, and we'll also present an argument about how actually a data argument about how data functions in this kind of capitalist way within AI, in that it needs to be reinvested in order to produce its own capital, relentlessly reinvested to produce its own capital. And then I'm going on sabbatical July 1, and I've been doing research for years on a book that I plan to finish writing that's about the politics of technology in the sex industries, and it looks at four different technologies. It looks at payment processing, video streaming. Oh my God, AI is one of them, and user experience design, user interface design, graphical design, basically. Um, and then I've got a contract to write a book about a very short introductory book about these two silent era French stag films from the 1920s. French stag films that are
What's a
really
stag film?
oh, it's a porn. It's a silent era porn that you would have shown in
Oh,
like a basement or something. Yeah, in the early days of cinema. And the director is really well known for having been the former owner of Pathé, but not everybody surprisingly knows that he was a pornographer in his early days or that he was a gay pornographer. And some people do. I mean, if you really, there's like two scholars out there who've written about this. But it like obscurely, like one wrote about it in the early 90s, and then the other one came along in like the early 2000s to sort of correct some facts that had been made a decade earlier. Anyway, that's getting too in the weeds. My point is I'm writing a book about these two gay porn films from the 20s that are like the oldest examples we have of straight up gay porn. So that doesn't sound right. But I mean, like where there's actual intercourse, because even Lumiere has like some homoerotic stuff happening. But in this case, they're the oldest examples we have um intercourse, like gay intercourse. So yeah.
fascinating. So that's 100 years old. Is that the concept?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Well, they're both what you're in. Yeah, they're both more than 100 years old. Yeah, a little over 100 years old. Yeah.
Okay. So
Yeah.
you mentioned how this is a good starting point, this book, for folks looking to explore this topic. So what
Mm.
other pieces of literature would you recommend for someone interested in learning more about this?
Well, there's a great book called Feminist Data Studies, I think, by Catherine Ignacio, and I think it's Lauren Klein. And you'll see in my introduction that, of course, I reference them. I also think Economization of Life by Michelle Murphy is a really good book for thinking about data extractions and how we make decisions about quote unquote population based on data. Um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, in my introduction, I also give a sort of genealogy of queer data that might not be obvious. So I sort of take as a starting point that there are people who've been writing about queer data, even though they haven't done so explicitly, and they might not say that that's what they're writing about, but that within their writing, you can see a kind of queer data politics emerge. And so I trace this sort of the like secret genealogy of queer data, or writing about queer data. And of course Munoz is part of that, and City Hartman is part of that. Venus in Two Acts, right? And who form the epitaphs at the beginning of the introduction, and then I take us through like science and tech scholarship that has touched on this, communications and media scholars, archival studies scholars, because there's a lot of fantastic writing about queer archives that touch on this. Um, and so I take you through different sort of fields and show you how there are people who've been really thinking about queer approaches to data, even if it's not obvious, right? So,
Great, thank you. Have I missed anything? Is there anything you would like to add from our chat today?
oh, I don't know. I don't think so. I'm really grateful to be here, and I really appreciate you taking the time. So, and thank you everyone for showing up.
Yeah, we have a little bit of time for questions, folks, so please put them in the chat if you do have them. My question personally was if we could design a perfect, we talked a little bit about policy for like the
Yeah.
optimal policy. I focus a lot on data science and data sovereignty and digital citizenship.
Mm,
Um,
cool.
what is the focus? How could we create this sort of utopia concept of where queer data is the best possible version of itself?
Mm. I don't know that I mean, while I love liberatory politics, I'm not sure if it's possible. I mean, one of the things I learned from this book is that even though queer people have some sophisticated approaches to data, there are plenty of examples in the book where queers have a terrible approach to data or an unsophisticated approach to data. So I don't know. I mean, I guess I was left with a kind of more a feeling that it really depends on certain contexts, and that it's really about thinking through who's it for, who's doing the counting, why are they counting, what's it going to be used for, and if it's not counting, how do we imagine data differently so that it's not numbers alone? Is it feelings? Is it in forms of intimacy like it is for the hookup culture in Lebanon? Is it, what is it that counts as data that can help us basically create conditions for queer life? Um,
Thank you. We have a question, Alexis,
Yeah, is it okay if I ask out loud? I was going to write in the chat
please.
and then I was like, I
Yes,
am
please.
so long-winded. Dr. Keilty, I love this book. I
oh, thank
pre-ordered
you.
this book. Um, I was very excited when I saw that this chat was happening. And I guess I'm curious to ask you, within the context of the new presidency and knowing that I think there's such a precarious element with like digital visibility. I think there's importance with representation, particularly with collecting queer data to meet community needs. But then I also think we've seen how time and time again, data is weaponized against marginalized communities. I think in chapter 3, Gary Kafer, I think, talks a little bit
Mhm.
about that opacity of being both
Yeah,
this method of resistance, but also something that these platforms use to be like, we're going to take this down and not tell you why, haha. And you're like,
yeah,
oh, okay, cool. So I guess I'm
yeah.
curious what your perspectives are on like queer data, both as data about queer people, but also I think what you define as this like peculiar or irregular data
Yeah.
within the context of like the second presidency. Like, do we
Oh
go
man.
hiding? Do we push back even harder? Like these, I think I've been grappling with what happens now when I think data visibility is so important, but
Yeah.
also it's such a dangerous time.
Yeah. So I think it depends on the kind of data, right?
Mhm.
I think it's really scary that the Trump administration wants people to snitch on one another for their
Terrifying.
political views. Yeah. And so, of course, I think there are ways, I think there are moments like this where you're going to have to come up with sophisticated approaches to being not surveilled, but seen by the people who need to see you. And maybe we can learn from Munoz for that. But you're right. I mean, this is a moment of unprecedented sort of visibility for queer people, and that visibility is being wielded back against us, especially for trans people. And so, I mean, I don't know. I think we have to get smart about how we're seen and for whom we're seen and in what contexts and how we can be, if need be, unseen by the people who would do us harm. Um, so I wish I had a more concrete answer than that. It's more of a guideline than, but I think it depends on the specific context, right? In which visibility and invisibility is occurring. So
No, that's wonderful. It sounds like everyone is terrified and there's no right answer, which feels oddly enough like a good enough answer. So I appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Keilty.
yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you very much for that question. Yeah, ODLAN has a mandate to create digital safe spaces and access for our communities. And we take it as our responsibility to not be quiet. The louder the extremists get, the more
Yeah,
we need to stand up for ourselves, because the fear response that we're experiencing is real.
yeah,
However, it's our for those of us who can march should, right?
yeah.
So obviously, as you said, it's all context specific.
Mm,
That perspective is important. But ODLAN strives to continue to collect data, publish research on this topic. And I am
yeah,
going to shamelessly plug our report launch, which is on digital resilience and transphobic online hate, which is
yeah.
coming out in March.
Awesome. Yeah, and I will say, there are institutions that can do this in the US, like the Williams Institute at UCLA, of course. I mean, perhaps now more than ever, right? Its studies and its data is really important. I think, yeah, it depends on where you are and from what point of view. But I don't know. I don't know if you saw the Masha Gessen interview. I can't remember if it was in the New York Times or the New Yorker on one of their podcasts, where she basically said, people will find all kinds of reasons to justify accommodating the administration, for good, honorable values. But in the end, that hurts the broader resistance, right? And so figuring out how to resist without doing harm to a community that you care about is, I think, going to be paramount going forward.
Well, I'm very excited to see your upcoming book that you've mentioned on technology and the intersection of queerness. I think that's going to be really, especially given this current circumstance, I think that's going to be a very powerful read. I have another question here from Christian.
Hey, Christian, I think you might have to
I'm
unmute.
trying to turn my camera. Hey,
Yeah.
Hi.
can you hear me? Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you for the talk. It was very interesting, and I was looking forward to listening. And I have a question. Like, I think time and time again, like with Facebook and Instagram and TikTok, we keep building like a spaces of activism. We keep building communities in there, right? But these platforms change all the time, and legislation changes, and then all that history is destroyed in some ways, right?
Yeah.
So I understand that there are problems of safety, I guess, at this point, but also how can we conserve these histories that we're building now? I don't know. It's
Yeah,
just
it's a really good question. I think it's a great sort of digital humanities question. Do you know Avery Dame Griff and their book, The Two Revolutions, The History of the Transgender Internet?
no,
Because
but
I
I'm
think,
writing.
okay, yeah, because I think that that's kind of where their work is going, is how do you create an archive of the trans internet, right? When the ebb and flow of the internet means that things disappear. I know, just maybe coming full circle to where I started the talk, when we did the guerrilla archiving event to save environmental data from Trump, we actually teamed up with the Internet Archive, which is a nonprofit sort of ethical legacy organization. And we built a Google Chrome extension that allowed us to crawl websites more thoroughly than what the normal web crawler does, and to pick up certain kinds of data. So there are certain kinds of technical solutions, but they require community coalition as well, right? And they require community action and people coming together. It can't just all be automated. Yeah, I don't know. I'm hoping that there's more queer digital humanities projects that will address some of this. People who are smarter than me will know how this works. I know Laura Horak has an amazing archive of like trans media that is like, it's really a database of trans media at Carleton University. That might be another place to look for what kinds of queer digital archive projects exist out there. And our faculty is hiring next year in both tenure track jobs in both digital cultural heritage as well as digital humanities. And so I don't know, maybe we'll hire a queer trans person to help us figure out how that works. I mean, I don't know, they're not queer trans specific, but I'm hoping we can hire a queer trans person to address those issues. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for one more question before we head out. Anybody wants to jump in, or I'm going to just keep talking. Oh, I have a question from Sydney. Is anyone else working with commercial platforms like Grindr to capture queer data?
Grindr, yeah. I mean, there's always somebody writing about Grindr. Yeah, I'm sure that Grindr, so Grindr has a complicated politics, right? And I suspect that one of their revenue streams is to actually sell their data to third parties. You know, but one question you might ask is, are they doing anything good with their data, and for whom and for what purpose? And I don't actually have the answer to that question. I just know that, and I think they're no longer gay owned. Like, I think at some point the gay guy that founded Grindr sold it to a major tech company. And so it's now just part of the broader corporate tech ethos, you know, broader corporate tech like conglomerate. Yeah, my answer to that is I would hope that the company still has a sort of you know, queer ethics, whatever that might be, or at least that they care about queer lives. Maybe that is what queer ethics is, and that they are using data in ways that really support queer life. So,
Thank you. All right. Well, folks, it's been a great hour. I really appreciate you all for attending today. Thank you especially to Patrick for talking to us about your wonderful work.
yeah.
It was truly a privilege to listen to
Yeah.
you and pick your brain on this awesome book.
Thank you all.
Got my dog-eared copy that I will continue to pick away at. And thank you everybody for your time today.
No, thank you. Bye.